What's up, KoreKara Squad? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, on this channel, I help you learn Japanese as fast as possible. Personally, I learned Japanese and passed the JLPT N1 in 1 year. And on this channel, I've interviewed nearly 100 of the most high-level Japanese speakers, breaking down how they were able to do it. Some people you might be familiar with, like Maverick Japan, Dogen, Tokini Andy, and more. So in this video, I wanted to break down 5 of the top key takeaways and patterns that I've noticed after interviewing them and how you can apply that to accelerate your Japanese learning. But first, I'm so proud to say that this video was brought to you by the KoreKara Club. If you're studying Japanese, the KoreKara Club is the best place to accelerate your learning. You'll get access to my course on how to learn Japanese in a year, be able to ask me questions directly in our monthly group call. Also, just keep yourself accountable with studying Japanese and making progress with the language. Because of you guys' support, I can actually continue to make videos on this channel, so I really appreciate that. The first key takeaway that I learned after interviewing all these people is that learning a language is simple, but not easy. If you've watched some of the videos on the channel, then you know that learning a language is really a subconscious process, which means that all you need to do is have enough exposure and put yourself in the right place for you to acquire it. But even though it sounds really simple, it's not easy. It's not exactly a very smooth process because you have to make a bunch of embarrassing mistakes, struggle to push yourself through immersion that you barely understand in order to one day get to the point where you're actually comfortable with using the language. It takes hundreds and hundreds of hours to learn Japanese to fluency, and then thousands of hours if you want to get to a really advanced level. How you allocate those hours is really up to you, but fundamentally it's impossible to learn a language if you're not having a large amount of exposure to it. Yeah, don't get fooled by apps that say that you only need 5 minutes a day to learn Japanese, or if you use this, you can learn Japanese in 30 days. I'm sure even when you watch this video, probably in the beginning you got some ad about how you can use some tool to learn Japanese grammar or Japanese vocabulary. And while it's true that it might help you learn some new vocabulary or grammar, it probably won't help you acquire the language. The minimum that I've seen after interviewing 100 of these people is that it usually takes about 1 to 3 years to really get to a level of fluency, and maybe even 10 plus years if you want to get to that near native level. There's really only one secret to learning Japanese, which leads me to the next takeaway. Live a life in Japanese. The best speakers that I've interviewed on the channel all have had lived a life in Japanese, whether that was living in Japan, working in a Japanese environment, or even just having a significant other that they could speak Japanese to on a daily basis. The reason why living a life in Japanese is so powerful is because there will be these little moments where you forget that you're actually speaking Japanese. Like, it could be having an argument, or maybe you're quitting your job in Japanese. But those tiny little moments that add up and compound will really make the difference of whether or not you're really comfortable with the language. So if you have the chance to actually go to Japan, whether that's like to study abroad, stay with a host family, work in Japan, or even just travel there, you should take it, because ultimately the memories that you consolidate in Japanese will help you acquire the language at a faster pace. Even though that is the secret to learning Japanese, there is one hack that I found to accelerate your Japanese learning, and that's the next takeaway. The best hack is to be obsessed. This is a pattern that I've noticed with every high-level learner that I've interviewed on the channel. They were all highly obsessed with learning the language. And this isn't just something that's true with language learning. This is something that you'll probably notice with everything. One of the interviews that really stuck out to me was when I interviewed Julian Godfroy, who's this guy who got to a native level in Mandarin Chinese. When I interviewed him and asked him how he was able to do that, he simply said that he applied what he learned with being a professional celloist to language learning. So he studied 12 hours a day, every single day for over 5 years. It's pretty amazing to hear somebody say that so bluntly and succinctly. But this is something that I've noticed with all high-level speakers of any language. Like people like Maverick Japan, they went all in studying Japanese full-time with every waking hour. Of course, they would get to a super high level. Speaking from personal experience, this isn't something that you have to actually do forever, but if you have the opportunity to, it's worth setting aside some time, whether that's like for a couple months or even just this year, to dedicate to learning Japanese or any other language. Having that period where you're hyper-focused at learning Japanese will be super helpful, because all those things that you've learned and consolidated isn't going to be forgotten later on. When you're actually obsessed with learning Japanese, even if you study with inefficient methods, it doesn't actually matter, because just the sheer amount of exposure and deliberate practice that you have will be enough to actually push you and accelerate you to fluency. But even if you have that obsession with learning the language, there is one mistake that I've seen that kind of slows down people's progress, and that's the next takeaway, which is deliberate practice is necessary to get fluent. What I really mean by deliberate practice is speaking. Every person that I interviewed kind of slightly had a different journey to getting fluent in Japanese, but the one pattern that they all had in common was that they all went through long periods of speaking and sucking in order to get to a point where they're actually hyper fluent in the language. There are a ton of videos on YouTube that talk about how input is the most important thing to actually acquire a language. And while that is true to be able to comprehend the language, you won't actually get good at speaking if you don't start speaking. I'm actually making a video now about why and how you can start speaking to natives, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. But the biggest misconception that I've seen on YouTube and language learning communities is that input is all you need to get fluent, and that early output is bad. The truth is that while speaking early may not be that helpful because you'll be making a lot of mistakes, it will actually give you that confidence to be speaking later on, and you also make friends who are native speakers of the language. As long as you're making an effort to continue to study the language and improve your speaking, you won't have the problem of speaking weird Japanese over a long enough time frame. The only trap that I've seen is that some people get to a stage where they are really comfortable with speaking the language even if they make a lot of mistakes, and they stop improving. And maybe that is a level that you want to get to. The only way to figure it out is to get there. The idea that deliberate practice is necessary also emphasizes the fact that textbook study and theoretical study will only get you so far. In my video about how to learn Japanese in a year, I only encourage you to stick with the basics for about 100 days. If you're part of the KoreKara club, I also break down exactly how you can do that most efficiently. But basically, setting a limit of when you're going to stop using beginner material is only going to accelerate your Japanese learning. The fifth takeaway is probably the most surprising and what some people don't want to hear, and that is that learning a language is really a lifelong process. It's really easy to think that you can just learn Japanese once and then just be perfectly fluent forever. Like, it's true that you can learn to a level of basic fluency or even intermediate fluency in about a year or 3 years, but to really get to that stage where you're at a near native level or you can fully function in the language without any problems, that's going to be a lifelong process. The interview that really stuck out to me was when I interviewed Peter Barakon, who is this Japanese DJ, and he has been living in Japan for I think over 50 years. He's like in his 70s or maybe 80s now. And when I talked to him, he said that there are still things that he learns on a weekly basis, even though he's been living in Japan for basically more time than he has lived in the United States. And this is somebody that actually gives hour-long radio shows in Japanese, and he has written multiple books in Japanese and appeared on Japanese TV multiple times. I've even shown his Japanese speaking to some Japanese friends, and they say that he basically just sounds like any other oji-san. Just speaking to him really just shifted my perspective into realizing that language is something that constantly is evolving. Even with our native languages, we still learn a bunch of new words every single year, and as we read more books or we have more exposure to our native language, we get better at expressing ourselves, we get better at reading comprehension, and so that's the same especially with learning a new language. While learning a language to fluency can be a pretty short and accelerated process, to actually get to a near native level, that's going to be a lifelong process. And also in relation to this, another aspect that's often forgotten is the concept of language attrition, which is the fact that if you stop using a language over a long period of time, your brain is just going to start forgetting it naturally. I've felt this multiple times for my native language and even Japanese sometimes, but I've also met people who have moved to the US and just completely forgotten their heritage language after living here for a couple of years. You have to really integrate the language into your life, or else you're just going to forget it. Luckily, if you're studying Japanese, it's one of those languages that has just insanely good media, so you're probably not going to run out of Japanese content if you are passionate about the language and the culture. But yeah, that's it. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to learn Japanese. And if you want extra help with Japanese or you're really serious about Japanese, then check out the KoreKara club. And I'll see you there. Peace.